Hey guys, this is Ryan Nolette, and today we're going to be talking about using osquery in cloud environments. What we're going to go over today is a little bit about who I am, why this ends up being a unique topic for me, and kind of going over some pain points on dealing with EDR, such as osquery, and finally, kind of a real life example that happened a couple of weeks ago, where we ended up doing a incident response with both osquery and without it, just to kind of compare what it's like. So today we're just going to kind of talk about how to do this with about 30% less tiers than our closest competitors. So my name is Ryan, at least that's what my mom tells me, and I've been working in security for about 15 years. I'm the co-author of AWS Detective, if you guys are familiar with some of the security tools up there, as well as a published author on threat hunting and incident response. But why do you care? The reason is because over the last 15 years, I've broken a lot of things, right? I found a lot of pain points while trying to do incident response, and you will at least once ask yourself, where's my data? Because you always want to be answering questions, and trying to gather that data is one of the most important aspects of doing incident response. And then as your environment grows, as most things do kind of organically, you start to see those growing pains. So how do you scale with your infrastructure as it grows? And then how do you know what you don't know? Basically, your visibility gaps. How do you know what you can't see? And once you find that gap, how do you get it? And now that you have the data, how do you use it? Well, this is what I want to be kind of a start to that conversation. And the first thing going over is, where's the data? So with this being a more of an osquery focused presentation, we just want to quickly touch on the environment that we're working in, right? AWS. So an incident occurs up there and you need to respond. Oh crap, I don't have endpoint visibility. What do I do? Where do I go to get my answers? So let's get this out of the way first. Cloud is not on-prem. The same controls do not work, and there are some equivalents, but not all, and there are other technologies that aren't available on-prem, and it is a new experience. Your mileage may vary, but for the most part, you're going to be using a lot of the same techniques, but the tooling is going to be different. So this chat, or this slide specifically, is what can we do instead? So for that net flow, we look at VPC flow. For DNS, we have Route 53, all these types of tools. And I'm going to leave this up for a minute, so just so people can kind of look at it. You can come back to the slides later and see what this comparison looks like. What we're really trying to show here are, these are the data sources I'm going to use to try and equivalent what data I get from osquery. So how is the visibility at scale achieved? Well, it should be achieved the same way that infrastructure scale is achieved. So talk with your DevOps guys, talk with your teams of engineers. You don't want to have to reinvent the wheel just to implement a security solution. We want to couple our security controls with infrastructure deployment, so that way they grow together. And then also your engineering teams are used to working within those guardrails. So a few examples of the tools and technologies that I use to support my osquery at scale deployments before getting on board with, like a vendor management solution, is something like the infrastructure as code. So do you have your visibility controls plugged into your automated templates, your Terraform, your CloudFormation, any of those kinds of things? Build your tools into your AMIs. So you can get a custom AMI and build osquery directly into it. And then whenever you do execute that automated build of your infrastructure, you're able to call that AMI with the tools you want already built into it. And lastly, remote management. So I'm a big fan of SSM right now, as it's native to AWS and has a lot of functionality I care about. and not a whole lot of things that I don't use. However, if you have more needs, you can go with something more traditional like Chef or Ansible. Puppet's good. I keep hearing great things about Prometheus, so I tossed it up there, but I haven't used it yet. Something to check out later. So now that we've kind of gone over a couple of methods to put visibility at scale, let's talk about the audit for visibility coverage. So what we're kind of looking at here is what I call the source of truth. Show me everything. And to do this, we can use tools like SSM or config that are native to AWS, or you can use more traditional things like Active Directory, G Suite, Okta. Basically, you need the source that shows all of your resources, and then you compare those lists against that main list. What we want to do is we kind of want to bring light to that darkness. We want to do those diffs. We want to figure out what we don't currently have visibility into, right? The know what you don't know kind of concept. We can do that through some common things like, hourly scans, heartbeats from your applications. We're moving into that cattle versus pets kind of mentality, and that's really how we're going to want to handle our coverage gaps. Now, I know there was just 2 or 3 quick slides about scaling and things like that, but the truth is we could talk about that for days. And this presentation is more about some of the real world things, the things we laughed, we cried, the Oscar moments, the actual reality of what we're doing in the field. Now, if you guys want to talk more about these things, well, feel free to reach out to me afterwards, and we can talk about some topics that are more near and dear to your heart, but we have time constraints, so let's get moving. And now with that foundation, let's go through some real-world examples. In the demonstration, I really want to show how much faster it is to validate and triage a finding with endpoint telemetry than without it. And the thing is, we really don't want to miss anything. So let's kick in. Now, the first thing we're going to go over is an example of one of the guard duty findings that we had. So this is our catalyst event, all right? This is the reason why I'm doing an incident response, or at least a triage of a finding. And for one of the internal instances, here we see it making DNS queries to a known bad domain. The domain is known bad because of a threat intel source that AWS uses. Now, this one specifically is they're grabbing some data, they're trying to sneak out with it. If anyone sees them, they hide, and then wait for the coast to kind of get clear and keep going, just like one of my favorite movies. But what's specific about this alert, and my apologies for the black bars on the images, but I like you guys, but not enough to let you see what my internal naming scheme is. You get that. The information that we can take from this alert is kind of interesting. So first, we have things like the host name and instance ID. Those are great indicators to look at for figuring out how things are going to be configured in your environment. We can also look at the TLD that's being looked up. So that's the external domain that ended up firing off the alert. And finally, we have some more internal information, specifically networking. So IP addresses, VPC ID, and subnet ID. So with that information, what can we do with this? All right, we have our catalyst, we have our indicators that we're going to be looking at, and we have attributes of the instance in question, as well as the remote instance, whether that's the attacker or the person receiving things. Regardless, we have some very nice attributes to go start looking at associated content. So let's do that. So the finding of validation. First, I want to validate the information in the finding. Right? Was it a true positive or a false positive? Well, let's find out. Let's ask the same questions to a system with osquery installed and a system without it installed. As a caveat, we're not currently concerned with maintaining a level of data integrity required for legal cases. So if you need that, you're probably already familiar with creating and using gold, silver, and bronze images, as well as common best practices around forensic acquisition. This is not that example. This specifically is more of an IR triage method, and I would not use this method if my findings had to be applicable in court. But first thing we're going to do is we're going to basically decide, is osquery installed? And in this case, no, it is not. I am a sad panda. We're going to keep moving. So now that we know that osquery is not installed, did the system in question actually make that request? All right, that's the end question we're trying to do to validate whether or not this is a true positive. So without osquery, I'll give you a moment to process the sadness that came with that statement. But what we're going to be doing is something similar to the threat hunting loop for incident response, because we don't have a single source of truth and we need to do a bit of guess and check to tighten our sights. And let's start with searching for associated information based on those attributes we have. So the attributes that we're really looking at are network based. So in that case, my data sources are going to be VPC flow for NetFlow, DNS, which is that Route 53. Recently, AWS did enable DNS query logging, so we're going to be taking advantage of that. WAF, so if traffic actually went across the WAF into your environment, that would give us layer 7 visibility into it. VPC is only layer 3. And then we're going to look at some endpoint logs, and that's raw endpoint logs, not actually collected with an EDR or anything like that. And then some of the AWS security services. Much props to previous company Squirrel for tossing this slide up. I can't remember if I made this one or if that was David or Matt that did it. But what matters here is that this is still used today by a lot of companies for threat hunting, which also leads us into a hunting maturity model. I'm not going to talk about this, but I'm going to leave it here for reference, so when you come back to the slides, you can check this out. Highly suggest reading it, but I won't dig into it now. So the first thing we want to do is ask some basic questions about the attributes, right? I don't have the osquery pulling the data, so I have to do a lot of this manually. If I had a SIM, the data like this would get pulled, but I'm going to pretend that I'm a small company, I don't have a SIM, I don't have any security tools outside of what AWS provides. So we're going to ask some basic questions like the external domain. Here you can see me doing a simple lookup on VirusTotal, which you can do directly from osquery or one of the management suites for it. A lot of them have this kind of third-party intelligence built in to help correlate that data. Now you're bringing those disparate data sets together and you're starting to turn raw data into actionable intelligence, which is really what we want to do here. Also, the links for these things are going to be in the slide notes, so you can go check them out yourself. The next thing I want to check out is some history. So from looking up that domain, I was able to pull a history of IP addresses from Whois lookups and abuse databases. And these are all free and open source tools. There's about 6 different ones, as you can see on the screen, that I used. There's dozens. Links to all of these will be, like I said, in the notes. But what we want to see here is, does this external guy have a history of abuse? All right. Do other people say, yes, this guy's been spamming me, or they've been doing SSH brute force attempts, or any of these other activities that I care about? And that's what threat intel is going to give me, is context, right? You're adding that context to your raw data and trying to turn it into actionable intelligence. You're going to hear that theme an awful lot from me. So what about the native sources? Well, let's talk about VPC flow. One of the first attributes we can use is the internal IP address and the external IP address of the request. We can search VPC flow for any connections between the two hosts. So here you have a very basic query of my VPC data, which is partitioned by year, month, and date. Highly suggest you do that for any of your data sources you toss into Athena, because you can now group smaller sets of data together and it returns much, much, much faster. The only limitation of seeing the network traffic external to the host has been enabled for every VPC, or will not be logged. If you have multiple VPCs in your cloud environment, you have to enable every single one. Now, That's not so much a concern when you build your images with an EDR solution already built into it. But I digress. Here we're searching for the bad IP source. Is the destination or the source of the actual connection. What we see in the results is that there's an SSH connection attempt inbound as well as a response from the internal system outbound. So we do know that some traffic occurred. We know that that external system is starting to poke at us. We also have some domain information from the guard duty finding. We can look at the queries and resolve any events in the environment. Again, the only issue is that I can only see any DNS events happening outside the endpoint in question. So this has to be enabled in Route 53 and is a pretty recent addition to AWS logging, so you might not be used to it yet. But before this, the only way to get the DNS logging is with dedicated configurations, applications, or appliances. Those are expensive, they're difficult to scale a lot of the time because they don't work as infrastructure as code, and you can route around them in your environment. So the other data source, once again, I would have if I had osquery installed, as well as I would see the DNS requests that never left the system. So bad requests, if I have DNS misconfigured, any of those kind of things, I would still be able to see, but I can't here. So now that we kind of exhausted our options for external data, I know there was a long list of them, right? But we can make the assumption that the traffic was a remote SSH connection attempt because we saw that in our logs. And that hit the host in question, but how can we confirm that it was a successful connection? How can we confirm that that activity actually occurred and it wasn't just somebody on the internet trying to scan for open SSH servers, brute force it, toss in a Bitcoin miner, and call it a day kind of thing? Well, we need to check the SSH logs. So we could technically collect this with something like the CloudWatch agent on the host, but the stored data goes to CloudWatch and that gets expensive. And, I like having a normal paycheck rather than issuing it to tools that I use. So let's talk about alternatives to this. We're going to use SSM here because it's very much like SSH, except I can mandate it across my entire environment. But this is basically just going to get us a command prompt, and we're going to have to do manual searches. So I kick off a search for the known TLDs, or the known IP addresses attributes of that external domain. And here you can see that I ran tcpdump commands as well as some network commands, which you'll see on the next slide. But that's all I got for results. I searched the entire system for any log with any reference to those IP addresses, and I didn't get any, which means that system did not successfully log in, right? Because the SSH log should have had a record for it. If it was a web application, the web application log should have had a record for it, but they don't. So let's check out. Also, you can install Bro or Zeek on there, which might be another option. Speaking of that network stuff, since we don't have Bro, Zeek, or osquery on the host, we have to manually look for network connections. We saw that there was nothing in the logs, but are there any active connections? So here we can use things like Netstat to look at what the process was. We can also use tcpdump to see, is the host the source, the destination, what ports, any DNS, any traffic like that we can look at. But from this, we've now touched the host, which means we've made changes to it since this event occurred. And once again, that does ruin what's called chain of evidence or chain of custody, depending on where you're at in the US, for investigation. And that's a big no-no. So what are some alternatives? Well, let's do this process again, but this time we've got osquery installed. All right? I know, I can see how happy you are. I am just as happy. So let's see, did it actually make the request? Well, what did we look for first last time? We looked for network connections, then we looked for DNS, then we looked for actual processes occurring, all that fun stuff. So let's switch it up a little. Let's check for DNS first. Show me everything. I want to see every DNS request that ever occurred on this host. And I can do that with something like the DNS lookup table. You don't have to really see the results here because basically there's no results for the TLD. So that tells me that this host never resolved that external destination. All right, well, that seems like a open and shut case, right? Not exactly. That just tells us that it didn't resolve it. Now, what if there's an active connection occurring that didn't need to be resolved? So let's go look at that. Let's ask osquery about every connection. So not just DNS. I'm talking HTTP, SSH, KFC, all your different alphabet soups that you guys like. What here is we're looking for DNS lookups to socket events. So socket events are different than regular DNS or TCP requests, and the reason for that being is sockets don't have to fully create a connection, so they might not show up in logs. So we're going to do a specific search for that. Once again, no results. I'll show you guys the results in a second, but the overall concept is all three of these searches came up nil. So that tells me the host was never resolved. There's no open connections for it. There's no web requests for it. There's no traffic being sent out to it. And the only connection that we saw was a single response to an SSH query. So with all of these coming through, did we actually see anything? Nope. That was quick and easy, right? We can see that no system with osquery installed on it, which is another aspect that we'll dig into in a second about scoping. But we can see that on this specific host, with osquery on it, including our endpoint, attempted to resolve that malicious domain. So all known connections to that IP address of the domain name with upticks or any host, no results at all. That means no time after the upticks sensor was installed, osquery, any monitored system attempted to resolve the remote IP address. That is awesome news because it tells me that the finding, though the activity did occur at the external to my host domain, no activity actually occurred on the host. So then I took that and I expanded my scope to see, well, did anyone else in my environment talk to that? And I can say definitively no, because I have osquery across all of them. Now, those are all the network events and things that people are usually interested in. But since we're talking about an EDR sensor, probably want to know about processes, right? Well, let's see if there's any running processes with something we don't expect to see, especially those making network connections, because this is a network-based alert. And nope. Nothing's making network connections. No one expected running processes during the time box of the event in question. And that was quick and easy. So let's move on to the next thing, right? Wait, was that it? Yep. 4 slides. 4 slides of osquery compared to how many without it? Was it 8, 10? I don't remember the exact count. But the real question from this is kind of coming down to, do you still want to do it the hard way? Because I wouldn't want to do it that way either, especially with how much faster that was to answer those main questions. We were able to successfully triage not just the event, but also open up scope and triage our entire environment for that event and make sure that we didn't have an event on a visibility gap that did not trigger the Catalyst security system in question. That was kind of nice and shiny, wasn't it? So with that going, I want to thank you all for your attention today. Remember my motto, flag it, tag it, and bag it. And basically, if there are any questions, guys, let's dig in and have some more fun. Thank you.